World of Warcraft patch 1.8 didn't launch with an attached raid tier, and it didn't introduce overarching systems changes. This was a relatively small patch in comparison to some others, but understood within the fast pace of the vanilla patch cycle, we see that this patch was essential. It added world bosses, holiday events, reworked Blizzard's biggest battleground, but most importantly, it developed Silithus, setting the groundwork for the most significant world event that Blizzard would ever attempt. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the complete history of World of Warcraft, the series where we chronicle WoW's entire life as a live game. This series is brought to you by our patrons, and this month is a big one. First, it's Death Knight month. You'll get that loot. But second, we have an art book. It is a 56-page art book that chronicles the development of our Patreon art, of this channel, and an early look at our game, plus commentary from the team. It's a big bunch of loot for $25, shipping included, and all of this would not be possible without our patrons. So we thank them for their support, and with that, let us begin. Silithus, up until this point, was a mystery for players. It was a zone considered out of the way and nearly empty by most, with only a few wandering mobs. Its southern border hosted a massive wall complex, with an instance portal at its center, grown over with vines. Patch 1.8 established the Cenarian Hold quest hub, and it implemented a neutral graveyard, which furthered people's beliefs that this zone was about to get very busy indeed. The zone itself, of course, had its towering hives with swarms of Silithid insects so thick that they looked like ropes dancing across the sky. Players were introduced to the story of the Silithid, insectoid minions of the old gods and the Courage, their high caste of generals and royalty. Then the Twilight's Hammer clan had also taken an interest in the region. Now, these were traditionally considered by players to be servants of the old gods, and at this point, speculation was at a fever pitch. I mean, what even was an old god? At this stage, players didn't know. Players had been given small hints of these enigmatic old gods in the Black Fathom Deeps, or the heavily speculated clearing in Tirisfal with its haunting sound of rattling chains. But one of the most compelling references was the creature with a glaive impaled in its forehead in Darkshore that was surrounded by the Twilight's Hammer cultists. This giant skull embedded in the ground was highly reminiscent of the Faceless Ones that beset Arthas as he made his fateful journey through to Icecrown Citadel. It really was Silithus in this patch that players began to see a clear connection between the Master's Glaive, the Faceless Ones, and the Old Gods. And between that which lurked in the Emerald Dream and that was locked behind the Scarab Wall, this patch was the seed for cosmic horror to come. This, in essence, was the power behind the tale of the Old Gods, and patch 1.8 spurred a wave of speculation on the nature of Azeroth's most powerful enemies. Speculation was all the more poignant as so little was known at this time, and players had to depend on a few scattered references that were available to them. The Emerald Dream being occulted from the physical plane of Azeroth meant that players were mostly unaware of its importance, but around the planet, 4 mysterious portals stood at physical representations of its existence. These were the Bow of Shadows in Ashenvale, the Dream Bow in Feralus, Saradane in the Hinterlands, and the Twilight Grove in Duskwood. A corrupting influence had taken root in the Dream, and this was held up for the reason why Malfurion Stormrage was absent at the game's launch. Ysera and the Green Dragonflight protected the Emerald Dream, but 4 of their most powerful members, Lethon, Ysondra, Emerus, and Terrar, had been driven mad by the malign influence that had been corrupting the Dream. They would now stalk the 4 portals at the foot of 4 great trees, with any true dragon spawning in a weekly rotation. Each dragon had challenging mechanics for players to overcome, such as Lethon, who would stun everyone within 100 yards of him for 5 seconds, and then summon a spirit shade mimic of each individual in the raid. If one of these shades were to come into contact with Lethon, the dragon would be healed for 15,000 health. Now, the shades only had 500 health themselves, but they were immune to AoE, so it would still be a balancing act to kill all of them. Each dragon was really designed with the open world in mind with this patch, such that several groups would be actually competing for them at once. These world bosses really became a driving force for intra-guild cooperation and agitation. But fights such as that with Emerys meant that raids were not necessarily safe, even on PvE servers. You see, when she killed a character, a putrid mushroom would sprout at their corpse with a 600 damage per second AoE effect. Now, if this mushroom then went on to cause another death, another mushroom would spout, and this could cascade into a massive wipe chain reaction. It was not unknown for low-level players to grief a raid by swarming Emerys so that the mushrooms would sprout from their corpses, with Duskwood being a frequent target for this tactic, being, of course, so close to low-level Alliance zones. Now, the dragons were initially killed for the purpose of gear, such as the Staff of Rampant Growth, which had a pretty significant plus 84 to spells and healing. That wasn't all, though, as the majority of these items had nature resistance. Now, by this time, most players were stacking fire and shadow resistance. That was great for the current crop of raids, but less so for what would come next. And as players began to realize the importance of nature resistance, these dragons soon became a must-kill for top raiding guilds. Patch 1.8 Dragons of Nightmare launched on the 10th of October 2005, and being the patch before Halloween, it launched the in-game Hallows End event. Now, this was continuing Blizzard's drive to bring thematic events that correlated with real-world holidays into the world of Warcraft. Decorations were put up in all the major cities and a few other popular locations. Now, this included things like the pumpkins, the huge pots of treats, with the place generally looking a lot more dark and spooky, especially the Undercity. Now, this event had repeatable quests and holiday-specific rewards. That includes things like the Hallows End pumpkin treats that, when consumed, would turn players into a skeleton or a pirate. Now, I think more interestingly from a lore perspective, this event hosted the Wicker Man Festival. Alliance and Horde will remember this for different reasons. The Horde would attempt to disrupt the Alliance's Hallows End celebrations with pretty juvenile pranks, like throwing stink bombs over South Shore. The Alliance, on the other hand, used the refreshing power of pine to clean the place up afterwards. And while that's all well and good, this event will be most fondly remembered by Forsaken players. It was the most important date on their cultural calendar, marking their freedom from the influence of Arthas and the Scourge. So, to this end, they celebrated by erecting a colossal Wickerman effigy to be burnt in commemoration. The celebrations were led by Dark Caller Yanka outside the ruins of Lordaeron, but Sergeant Hartman in South Shore would send Alliance players over to investigate, allowing them to see the event unfold as well. Sylvanas would even take part in this celebration, announcing to all those in Tirisfal, now is the time to shake the world to its foundations. Now is the time to remind those who would enslave us that we shall never yield. This was a lore-driven experience for the Forsaken players, and it set out their racial agenda for expansions to come. As you may have noticed watching this series, the developers have been pretty darn hard at work perfecting the talent system throughout vanilla. Previously, Blizzard had imagined a more traditional feeling RPG system, wherein players would get 10 talent points and 1 skill point per level, and in turn these could be spent on a massive range of abilities and stat buffs at their class trainers. However, it was recognized that players would just place all of their points into the most relevant stats, so the classes would end up falling victim to a pretty two-dimensional min-maxing play style. So, as such, the talent system of World of Warcraft was a last-minute addition to the game. And while many of those talent trees are perfectly functional at launch, Blizzard understood they needed to take an in-depth look into them, and they basically scoped balancing some classes with each patch. Community managers fielded suggestions from the class forums. Those were, in turn, collated and sent on to the developers, who would then actually make the changes. Now, this round of balancing for patch 1.8 was for the Druids, a pretty darn natural pairing with 1.8's Emerald Dream focus. The class had been suffering in vanilla with poor mana efficiency and no really good way to manage threat. Now, one of the advantages they had in raids was long cooldown spells such as Tranquility, which now had its cooldown reduced and its mana cost dropped by 25%. Hurricane was taken off the talent tree and was made available to all Druids at level 40. This gave the class more utility in open world PvE and PvP, but Druids still had a long way to go, with the balance spec again seeing problems in mana conservation, and these problems ended up being to the point where, really in raiding, only healing was that viable for Druids. Then, an ironic note to throw in here for the Herbalists, Blind Weed had its size increased so the players could actually be able to see it. Alterac Valley was the first battleground the Blizzard ever constructed. They clearly wanted to make something that was monumental with this one, and while they certainly had achieved that, they did create something that was just a little bit too big for competitive PvP. So to bring the battleground a little bit more in line with their emerging design ethic, massive changes to AV were implemented. Now, the in-game context for these changes was that an avalanche had filled in two of the side lanes that ran parallel to the central valley of AV. Now, taking out the side lanes actually reduced the size of this battleground by about 25% of its total size. These lanes also had not been empty, right? The Wildpaw Gnolls and a troop from the Erithai Syndicate were wiped out as well. That wasn't all though. Alterac was not just physically reduced in size. The NPCs in the valley were also nerfed across the board. The Winteraxe Trolls were diminished as a result of the Avalanche of Balancing. Korak the Blood Rager moved from the Fields of Strife to Snowfall Graveyard, with his attached quests actually being removed from the game, and this led to some unforeseen balancing issues as well. You see, originally, if you completed the quests Korak the Blood Rager for the Alliance or the Legend of Korak for the Horde, one of the possible rewards was the Ice Barbed Spear. Now, this polearm was tuned for level 60, but it had no level requirement, so conceivably, a player could get it at level 51, which was a little bit mental. Now, this quest was changed so that as of patch 1.8, it was a reward simply for winning the battleground, and this led to a glut of this weapon on just every server being like on melee characters, giving people a pretty unfair advantage through those last 9 levels. That's not all though, several meta changes were also introduced to player selection, so the minimum number of players to start a game was reduced to 20, with a further balancing mechanic of a 1-to-1 draft from queued players, and the idea here was to have the battleground actually launch more often with a more even spread of belligerents. Then finally, this patch introduced some minor quality of life changes to Reputation. The tab would now display on mouse over how many points were needed to get to your next rep level. An extremely nice thing to have. And then along with this, the combat log would now also show precisely how many reputation points were actually granted through doing an activity. Reputation, as we are going to see in next week's episode, became incredibly valuable, and keeping track of it throughout the monumental quest chains will have needed to have been more intuitive than it was in, say, 1.7. So, check out next week's episode, our second special, the opening of the Gates of Anchorage. It was a mammoth script. I think it's going to be an incredible video, and it is one of the most unique events in World of Warcraft ever, one of the most unique events in gaming ever, and it's going to be a great video. So like and sub for that. Thank you very much for watching this series. A massive thank you to our patrons for making it all possible. So you can check that out down below. And with that, thank you, and I will see you next time.